All right, we're ready to go. So thank you all so much for joining. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you're coming from. We're super thrilled that you were able to see such a good turnout for our Maximize Formative Learning Opportunities webinar. This webinar is the second episode in our Getting the Most Out of Turnitin Feedback Studio webinar series. So we're really excited for this session, to jump into this session, which really is going to talk about how you can use Feedback Studio as a formative learning tool and really, turn those moments of plagiarism into teachable moments. And hopefully this will help you to continue to provide meaningful instruction and engage students, at a distance as we deal with the impact of COVID-19. So again, my name is Andy Miller. I work on the product marketing team here at Turnitin, and I will be your host today. And I'm super excited to have two awesome guest speakers joining me today, Larissa and Autumn. They're both very well versed when it comes to formative learning and assessment, and have some really great best practices that they're going to share with all you today on how to use Feedback Studio to do so. So I'll quickly open it up for them to introduce themselves.
Sure. You want me to go first?
Sure, go ahead, Larissa.
My name is Larissa Wright-Elson, and I am in Anchorage, Alaska. I was a middle school and high school English teacher for, I guess, about 17 or 18 years. And for the last few years, I have been the English and language arts curriculum coordinator for the Anchorage School District. I used Turnitin in the classroom and continue now to support the teachers in the Anchorage School District using Turnitin.
Thanks, Larissa. So my name is Autumn Otnad, and I'm the Professional Education Manager at Turnitin. I'm at my home office here in Seattle, and luckily Turnitin let us be remote before the world got turned upside down. So that's great to have a strong internet connection here. I used Feedback Studio in every classroom I ever taught in, which was middle school and high school language arts and social studies. But now I have the fortunate privilege to build professional development programs at Turnitin. This is how Larissa and I met. So this isn't our first time meeting each other. We've worked together on a couple of projects, and I come at this webinar with three different kind of perspectives as a former teacher, definitely a Feedback Studio user as a teacher, now building professional development programs with Turnitin, but also a doc student and focusing on education and digital educational leadership. So those three realms kind of come together to talk about formative learning. So I'm excited about this topic.
Great, and Larissa, if you want to quickly introduce yourself.
Oh, I already did.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, great. All right, so a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. Everyone's lines are going to be muted today, but if you do have questions, please ask them in the Q&A box there that you'll see at the bottom of your Zoom interface. We encourage you all to participate throughout today's webinar, and we'll be sure to leave time at the end to address your questions. Today's webinar will also be recorded, so we will send out that recording in a follow-up email probably tomorrow, so you can share that recording with your peers, or refer back to it at your own leisure. So with that, first off, what is Turnitin? Most of you are probably familiar with Turnitin, but for those of you who are not, really our purpose, or our mission is really to ensure the integrity of global education and research, right? And so one product that really helps us to achieve this mission is Turnitin Feedback Studio. So Turnitin Feedback Studio is a similarity checking, feedback, and grading solution, that really helps institutions to, safeguard their reputation. It helps them to promote academic integrity. And then if it's really used as more of a, if you can go beyond using it as a punitive tool and really use it as a formative educational learning tool, can really have a big impact on, student engagement, outcomes, and performance. So we're really excited to, kind of share some of those ways that you can really use Feedback Studio and really maximize your use with you and your students. So we've come up with some essential questions that are really going to help to guide our conversation today. So starting at the top left, we're really going to just kind of start with what is formative assessment and why is it really critical to helping students achieve success? Next, we'll talk about what really qualifies as effective formative feedback. What are some of the things that feedback, what are some characteristics you want to look for in providing that feedback to make sure it's the most meaningful it can be? Next, we'll talk about how formative feedback can, help students to become self-directed learners and really take ownership of their work. And then finally, we'll close out today's webinar talking about some best practices instructors can use to really use Feedback Studio as a formative, educational tool, and then some different ways that students can use Feedback Studio to access formative feedback on their own. So with that, now that we kind of have the essential questions that are really going to guide our conversation today, I'll kick it over to Autumn to talk about, formative assessment. So Autumn, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. So thank you everybody for doing, saying things in the chat and questions. Keep them up. There's going to be able to be people to answer those. But before we get into the discussion, with our special guest, I really wanted to level set and understand what we all mean by formative assessment. You may not directly call it formative assessment, but you're already doing this in your classroom or courses. Formative assessment is a planned, ongoing process used by all students and teachers during learning and teaching. It is used to elicit and produce evidence of student understanding and comprehension. And no matter the intended discipline, formative assessment is something that is happening continually. It really enables the student to learn and progress. So one of the options that you may see on here is something that you call it in your school district or in your classroom, like progress monitoring, which is a non-graded assessment to measure how students are responding to interventions to determine the effectiveness of the instruction and intervention. But it can be called several different things. Maybe you're using exit tickets as they leave the classroom, or you're doing fist to 5 in your classroom to really monitor how students are doing in the room. Formative assessment looks different in each room, and I wanted to say that Feedback Studio can help with those pieces that they're turning into you, but may not be that summative assessment at the end of the year or at the end of a semester. Larissa?
Right. And formative assessment is not just limited to those really short assessments either. You can give formative feedback to students, obviously on exit tickets, during discussions or small groups. And then you can also give essentially what is formative feedback to students on their summative assessments as well, to help guide their learning toward the next learning activities that take place in your classroom. And formative assessment is one of those things that kind of, should be happening all the time. If you're walking amongst your students and looking over their shoulders to see how they're progressing, it doesn't mean that you need to give them feedback actually at that moment, but you can plan for feedback that is still timely, but might be coming up the next day. Like I saw that most of you were still struggling with your thesis statements, and so let's review thesis statements again. And it's an opportunity for you to connect with students and monitor their learning and growth in your classroom.
Yeah. And so this slide, one of the things on the slide that I have to point out is this resource, which is available on it's a free resource available on Turnitin's website. It's the feedback loop poster, and I just love the colors, but not only that, I had it in my classroom as a poster in multiple places in the room, but I also had my students paste it into their interactive notebooks. So I just wanted to highlight that. And the other thing is that if we're talking about formative assessment, we're talking about formative feedback, I don't think that we can do that without talking about John Hattie. So there is much value anticipating when students' motivation is at its highest. Motivation is highest when students are competent, have sufficient autonomy, set worthwhile goals, get feedback, and are affirmed by others. So these assignments, no matter where you are in the loop, these assignments can keep going to the students and keep going to the students. You can keep getting them feedback, but unless motivation is also tied to it and a couple of the other pieces, you're still going to get the same result. So it's all about, finding that perfect meld between students and teacher. And I also wanted to say that I used to use this feedback loop and feedback studio while doing Readers Writers Workshop, Lucy Calkins Readers Writers Workshop, because it made it so that the one-on-one conferences were so much better. And so we really were able to have those one-on-one conversations, and the conversation was ongoing.
I love that in this, it's clear that you're not really ever done. You might be finished with the assignment and ready to turn it in, but you're not necessarily done with your writing, that there are still multiple opportunities for improvement.
So let's go right into this discussion, and I could talk about Hattie and formative feedback. You can see there's some of his effect size material on the slide here, but I'm going to kick it over to Larissa about this question. Why is formative assessment essential in achieving student success?
Well, I think, those of us who are here in this webinar, we're teaching students of a variety of different ages, from probably middle school through grad school at least. And our job as educators is to guide the students to be the most successful, whether they're grad students and they know more specifically what their goals for the course are, for that assignment are, or they're middle school students who are just trying to get through and, and get to high school and maybe get to college or get out there and get a job. Our job is to help them all along the way. And I like those three key questions that are there. Where am I going? Where am I now? And how can I get to where I need to go? Because students have the ability to ask themselves those questions, but then our job is to help them ask those questions and then kind of help guide them along the way. And what formative assessment and feedback does is it supports students with answering those questions, providing rubrics to begin with, helping them chunk up assignments so that they can accomplish a little bit at a time instead of one big, gobble. It's just a bunch of little bites. And then I think what we're noticing, especially right now when we're only able to connect virtually with students, and then even, there are a lot of students who are still struggling to get online or make connections, that formative feedback really helps students with where they are at that moment in time, not where their whole class is, but feedback that's really specific to them. And so that feedback can be used then to support differentiation and scaffolding in your classroom to make sure that every student has opportunities to be more successful, because you're connecting with them. And you know that Autumn has a different approach to writing than Andy does, or that, Laura does in your third period class. So to make sure that they feel like they're really seen, I think we provide rubrics and all kinds of great comments. But if we can tailor feedback to support the culture of our school and of our community, then students are more receptive to that feedback, and they're also more willing to ask questions and come in and get a little bit of assistance as well.
Yeah, well said. I just think that formative assessment is essential because they need to have a clear pathway to success. Those rubrics show where you are now and show where you can go next. What's the next step in my learning? It also allows for reflection. So it allows for that metacognitive moment of, okay, maybe it wasn't the writing assignment itself that got in my way of success, but maybe it was my time management. Maybe I didn't get it, maybe I didn't turn it in at the right time. So something like that is something that you need to take a second with formative assessment when it's not the big summative pieces, so you don't have to lay it out on the table. So practice makes perfect also. You need to have a chance to practice and see examples. If you can't practice, like, think about pro sports. If you can't have an opportunity to practice what you need to get done, then how are you ever going to get better? It's always that last piece that's worth all the points. And then again, reiterating what Marissa said, don't assume everyone in your class knows what you know. I'm the first one in my family to be in a doc program, and sometimes professors would say words to me and I would have to immediately go Google them. And so I just think that those, don't assume just because they're in these programs that you automatically know what how to start a dissertation. You got to Google those things. So, and that might, there's several different situations where that might happen too. So yeah, there's a lot of things that formative assessment does for student achievement.
Yeah, I used to see that a lot, especially with students getting started and providing thesis statements for their research papers and focus for their arguments. I would try to provide them tools so that they could look at examples along the way. And there are even some just, for middle and high school students, they're decent little generators for thesis statements. Here it is that I know I want to say, and then it helps craft that sentence for kids.
And opening up the pathway that you can ask those questions, those conversations where they can admit they don't know. That's really important as well. And you can do that through Feedback Studio.
Yes. I used to have a lot of students in AP classes, and they were often the most resistant to asking questions. They would stay after class and ask questions. They would email questions, but they wouldn't necessarily ask questions during class because they didn't want their peers to realize that they didn't know something that they thought they should have known.
Right. So thinking about those AP students, they've been top of my mind lately, having to take those tests at home. So what qualifies as effective feedback and assessment in your mind?
For the assessment that feedback and assessment to really be effective, I think the key, well, all of these are great, but one thing in order to get students to continue to improve is that it needs to be actionable, that students need to have multiple opportunities to go through and fix things, or else they're gonna well, not all of them, but some of them are going to just turn in what's done and what seems like, well, that's good enough, and settle for a grade rather than proceed with learning. So they might accept, even a D or a C just to be able to move on and go on to the next thing, because of a variety of different reasons. But I don't really think that that's good enough. I think that we want them to continue to proceed as learners of the writing process, and so that the following year they're more successful. And Autumn, I know you're going to make a great point about portfolios, and I've really been thinking about that quite a bit, that if students can look at their writing over time and continue to improve, that's fantastic. The closer you can get to providing really timely feedback. I know when you get a whole bunch of papers turned in at once, that's a little bit tough to provide personalized, timely feedback. But the more specific it is, that it's ongoing, that it feels like it is consistent with what you do in your class already, that you can say something. I'll go back to thesis statements because it's such a struggle. But when kids get it, they get it. So your feedback can be linked to, hey, remember what we did in class that day, or remember this, scaffold that we had in place, go back and try it out and see if it'll help right here. And I think this feedback is a conversation with students. So again, your classroom culture, your rapport with students is absolutely essential in order for them to take what you say seriously and figure out how to apply it, or how not to apply it. Because I think sometimes as educators, we like to give them a lot of feedback. It might not always be what they're looking for, and that's okay, because growing as a writer is not just about compliance. It's about figuring out for yourself what process works, and what's going to help you as a writer in the future.
Yeah, what process works for you is so important. Personalizing your process and knowing, where you are in the rubric, right? Are you mastery? Are you achieving? The big thing for me too with effective feedback is that it's aligned with the assignment that was given. So you don't just go off and start, railing on some sort of like grammar issue. Like some people get stuck on one thing. You really go to what the rubric says. So if it was an argumentative research paper, then you're really talking about that claim evidence reasoning. So if my former students were on this call right now, they would remember the CER written all over the paper. And the best thing is that I didn't have to rewrite that every time. I just got to go to my quick mark set and just pull it over to my paper every time, claim evidence reasoning. So it's also, there's the timely piece. It was really great at the end of the year when, some of my colleagues would still be grading. I would be done and they're like, oh, where's your stack of papers? I'm like, well, I got it all finished because it's on Feedback Studio, and I was able to have a quicker turnaround because it was on the computer. So there's all these pieces here that's meaningful to the person that Feedback Studio allows. Specifically thinking about some of those kids that need very specific feedback that doesn't necessarily go with, like potentially they have an IEP or 504, and then you need to talk about their writing, then you can give that in this, and it doesn't have to look different than anybody else's.
Right. They're also kind of like little mini teachable moments, because you can give information as to like why they need to make that change. And it's not just limited to, change this, but also the why behind it. So because they're kids, and humans, and as humans, we forget things, because you get caught up in the assignment. You're busy doing other things as well for other classes, or like right now we have kids who are stretched in all kinds of almost unfathomable ways, helping with family issues, not being able to see their friends or work collaboratively with one another, which was something that I tried to emphasize in my classroom. But when they're working in more isolation, it can be a little tough. And then editing some of those, I love what you mentioned about editing those quick marks. And again, as an AP teacher, you have all these little acronyms that you use in AP classes, and editing those quick marks to align with some of those acronyms and like little hints and tips that you hope that they'll be able to take into the exam with them. That's like, just part of their brain muscle memory. You can edit those quick marks in order to make it work for your students.
I love that. That goes right into the next question, brain muscle memory. So how does formative feedback help students take ownership of their work?
It helps students take ownership of their work because it is their work, right? So they are reviewing their own assignments. They're using reflection. They're taking one chunk at a time. And I recommend using Turnitin and have students just submit a paragraph or two of what will be their final essay. And at some point you can turn off that originality check so that nothing gets flagged in their essays, but they can continue then in that method to get formative feedback from you and from the things that we can kind of do automatically with Turnitin, which are fantastic. I actually liked, I'm a big proponent of reflection. I think that reflection really can lead to transformation. As educators, we can ask specific questions of students, or we can give them kind of specific areas of their writing for them to investigate. But it's really, teachers can tell you what to do and why to do it, but until that change becomes internalized, it's difficult to grow as a writer. So for a lot of my assignments, I started emphasizing by giving more points to the reflection assignment that can come at the end of that series that you have students turn in. More points went to the reflection than went to the actual paper assignment. Because I really wanted to learn more about them as writers and what their process was, and be completely transparent. Like, I feel like I didn't really do very well on this because I didn't start it until the night before. I know we worked on it in class and I got a little bit done, but I also, had a test coming up in physics that I needed to study for. So, and I definitely feel like students learn, and myself learn quite a bit from the mistakes that they make along the way, and how those mistakes or missteps in that writing process then loan themselves to greater growth. Kind of like learning how to drive a car or learning how to ride a bicycle. You kind of know not to do that again because it didn't work out in the past. Rather than if everything that you do is always just good, like just getting an A. An A is a grade. It's not necessarily feedback. And even for a student who gets an A, there's always going to be more room for growth as well. I think an A might mean that you're doing well as expected for an 11th grader. But personally, as a writer, you're always working to get better, no matter what your age is.
Yeah. And that just makes me think about how important that rubric is that you can attach to each assignment. I used to have my students actually we would print it out and we would annotate the rubric, because you may be mastery in your focus and the formulation of your argument, but maybe there's some other elements of your organization or paragraph formation that needs a little bit of work. It categorizes each piece in something that's actually consumable and places where you can still move forward. But thinking about what's going on right now in the world and people doing remote learning too, it's just even more important to be clear about how you're going to be graded, if you're going to be graded, and how can I take ownership? Because even now I'm reading assignments sometimes on Canvas or on other LMSs, and I'm just like, wait, am I doing this right? Is this exactly what they wanted? And I know that the other students are having the same situation. So, just making sure that they can take ownership, they know how to ask for help, and they know how to move forward. The other thing that really helps me in my learning, and I know help my students too, is exemplars. I think that I used Feedback Studio for that the whole time, and that was great. But also teaching them how to use peer review. The first time I walked into class during my bachelor's, into my first English 101 class, the professor said, sit down. You had to come in with something written. Okay, hand it to your neighbor. I was not ready for that. It's that moment of release. You actually have to have a peer look at it. And that goes back to what Hattie said about motivation too, is that it's not just the motivation, self-motivation and motivation for the teacher, but if a peer is going to look at it, that's a whole nother level of motivation. And there's quite a bit of research that says that if you're going to assign peer review, the students actually get their work done faster, and they get more done before the due date. So that's the other thing, is making sure you're not doing that night before writing, because that maybe some people are able to get away with that, but not very many people. And then with the reflection, Larissa, did you use the reflection assignments in Feedback Studio for that?
Yes, and prior to using those reflection assignments, I did have students reflect really regularly on their grades at the end of a quarter or after timed writes that were handwritten in class. Um, but I really liked using that reflection assignment because then everything was really very directly connected in a linear fashion to that original paper assignment, and everything continued to be available there. And I just want to say I've become a huge advocate for giving students the rubric right at the beginning of the learning. So if you have a whole unit that is building to a specific assignment, if you have that rubric available right at the beginning, then you can unpack it and use it continually, like use it as a touchstone through all of the learning that's happening. And it's not really the same as, like, you know, teaching to the test. It's why is the learning that we're doing, why is it relevant? Why do I need to pay attention to this? Students like to ask the question, like, is this going to be on the test? And, you know, if you have a rubric and you have a meaningful assignment that students are continuing to work on, you can really scaffold for them. You can help and chunk over the course of, you know, even several weeks to help them build up their skills to be really successful, and actually even just have a first draft written by the time they get to that point. And each of those little paragraphs or chunks can then be shared with peers. And I do want to say that, like, I love peer review, and I used peer review as well. But one thing that peer review also does is it causes students to reflect on their own writing too, because they might be giving their peer, you know, comments on transitions, or I lost track of your argument. And then they'll be thinking, I'm not sure how my own argument was. I make that mistake too. I'm not sure I made it in this paper, but I'm going to make sure I avoid it in the future. And sometimes those peer reviews work a little bit in the same manner that exemplars do too. It gives them something to look at in order to think about how to make improvements, not just to their own paper. Sometimes that's too personal, making changes to your own paper. It's easier to figure out how to make changes sometimes to somebody else's paper.
Very true.
Great, guys. This has been a great conversation so far. So now we're about halfway through, 30 minutes in, so probably another 15 minutes of conversation before we open it up for Q&A. Now I really want to kind of shift gears in talking about, you know, best practices for using Feedback Studio as a formative learning tool. We can start with some of the instructor best practices, and then we'll jump into some ways that students can use Feedback Studio to access formative feedback.
Yeah, so Larissa, did you want to start us out, or I can start us out?
You can go ahead and start.
Yeah, so basically I used any tool possible with Feedback Studio. I was that person in the school that would like go down to the other room and load your rubric for you. So I can tell you which tool did I not use, basically, but I really did love the quick mark sets that you can save and you can create yourself. There's like the little image on the page really helps you kind of see that we have some collections already created, and you can pick and choose from those and make your own. So mine just had my name on it, and it had which assignment it was. And then you can also change the rubrics that they have preloaded in there to work for you as well. But I also utilized all of the inline comments, bubble comments, voice comments, and the voice comments were the most interesting. Larissa, you have things to say too about that. But my favorite piece with that was that you could use the quick marks, you could use the inline comments, the bubble comments, and highlights, and you can link most of those to the actual criterion in your rubric. So also thinking about what's going on in the world, I don't know how many of you are able to like concentrate and do all, I had 150 students at one time. Are you able to actually grade all of those in one session? there's no way that you're able to do that. So if you're interrupted in the middle of them, if you link those quick marks and those inline comments to a specific criterion, when you have to jump back into grading, it's right there for you. So if you don't have those, it's very hard to not have to restart each paper. But with life going on right now in the chaos, I don't know how you're not, you're gonna have to jump out in the middle of a paper. So that was also very, very helpful. And it was great afterwards to be able to converse with the student and have that conversation with them. And I mentioned exemplars earlier. If you have Turnitin and you've had it for a while, you have a portfolio of student work. So if I used to have the same assignment, something similar, I was able to go through my previous classes. You can't change anything, but then I would ask the student if they had a great example of maybe an argumentative paper. And I'd be like, hey, can I show this, take their name off of it? And if it's for something positive like that, it just emphasizes them, and they usually said yes, and I was able to show the other students. But you also can go like in the past years as well. So that's something that helped me along the way to show student growth in writing as well.
Nice. I love those rubrics. I loved being able to just use one of the rubrics from Turnitin, and I would make sure that my assignment and my expectations and all of my teaching in my class really helped students build to that point. I find that although there are lots of tools that help you create your own rubrics from scratch, I really liked being able to start with one that I knew was aligned to the standards that my students should be meeting, and I should make sure that I'm supporting them in meeting. And then if I needed to scale it back a little bit for whatever reason, then I could do that. I loved having those rubrics right in there for me to use with my students. I love the quick marks. I think I mentioned that a little bit earlier. You can customize them so that they really fit in with your teaching. And so any little like tips or tweaks that you have for your students that are things that you say in class regularly, you can reinforce that learning and kind of stimulate their memories of what you said in class and what you worked on by customizing those quick marks. And there's something about me, I love color-coded textual analysis. And so like earlier in this presentation, when you can kind of see those demo screens with the highlights and the inline comments and the bubble comments, there's something that's very exciting about that. I used to have my students in both exemplars and then also in their own writing assignments kind of a highlight claim, data, and warrant. This was for an AP language and composition class to make sure that everything was pretty evenly distributed. And you can do those same kinds of things then in Feedback Studio as an educator, but also if you have students highlight things before they turn it in, those highlights will still continue to show up, and then you can provide a little bit more. And I'll say that one of the reasons I love Feedback Studio is because as a mostly organized person, I still, I would take stacks of papers home with me and in order to try to grade them, and would find that with like pets or especially with small children at home, those papers just didn't get graded. I didn't want anything to happen. I didn't want, those like typical like coffee cup marks or anything unusual to happen when they were in the house. But then also I just wouldn't take that stack of papers out. It was hard to divide my time between, having little kids running around and trying to finish up grading on the weekends. And so I would, this is winter in Alaska, I would take my kids to places that still had Wi-Fi, like McDonald's Playland. And I was able to grade papers with just bringing one tiny bag that had, my computer in it, and grade papers from McDonald's while my kids ran around and got exercise. And then later I could go, not from McDonald's Playland, but I could go in and I could add voice comments, because really as an educator, love students the most, and connecting with students and having conversations with them about where they are in their learning process. And adding those voice comments makes it a lot more personable. And so that, especially at times when I feel like I made a lot of marks on their paper, I would go in and tell them how wonderful I thought they were and how much I could see growth in their writing. And sometimes that's difficult to add in a written comment, but you can add a voice comment to give that personal touch. And I think that's something that's probably really key right now when you're just not seeing your students in person as much as you would like to.
Yeah, Larissa, that just makes me think about how much I would have appreciated hearing my teacher's voice, and compared to getting that paper back and you know, go to the very last page and you just see that letter grade and you don't know why you got that letter grade at the very back. And so that's just something that is so much different when instructors use feedback studios, that there's just all these different ways to connect to your student. And my handwriting is personally pretty terrible. So that was something else. There was never any interpretation of what that said. That was always hard for me when I would get a paper back and I couldn't read half of the handwriting, but also for students, that was number one as well. They would see it on the whiteboard and they're like, whoa, what did she write? So that was helpful. But yeah, I also want to say that with Feedback Studio, you can offer resubmissions as well. So if you have that student who, you know, turned in something pretty early, they can get some immediate feedback, or maybe they want to go back in and turn it in again. They can. That's just within the settings. So that was something that you could definitely utilize, and we did at those lower grades. So that was great too.
Yes, absolutely.
Hey,
Giving
Autumn and Larissa,
opportunities.
sorry to interrupt. In looking at some of the questions coming through, there seems to be a couple questions around kind of like the role of peer review within formative assessment, and you know, Feedback Studio provides peer mark, our peer review functionality, and lets folks use those type of assignment types. So can you just kind of touch on, you know, how peer review really fits into, you know, formative assessment practices?
Right. So the way I used how it fits into into formative assessment, I'll get to in a second. But logistically for peer mark, I would typically you can change all of this in the settings, and so I would typically have students look at one or two other papers. I would make it anonymous. Because these are teenagers, and so I didn't want them to know whose paper they were reviewing, because often their feedback would change based on the personality of that other student. So if it was somebody that they liked, they might be hesitant to give them really constructive criticism. And then a mistake I made early on is I would use all of the questions that were suggested by Feedback Studio, and those were just too much. I did have like points assigned to it also, but giving all of those questions was just overwhelming for students. And then I would go through and I would read what was written for peer mark, especially since I had points assigned to it, to make sure that that feedback was really useful and not just, hey, good job. And then for formative assessment, I think it helps, especially if students are in the same class, in the same section. And I did typically have in my AP classes between 25 and 32 kids. And I think that's where we are in the Anchorage School District now, is we would teach 5 of 6 classes, and you know, between 25 and 35 students per section. So I made sure to schedule when papers were due as much as I could, but typically like 2 sections of an AP class, I would have, you know, 60 papers turned in all at once. And so if my students could take a little bit of that lift and give a little bit of feedback, that's fantastic. And we use a lot of small group work, collaborative construction in my classroom all the time. So really peer mark was just an extension of the ways that we worked in class already.
Yeah, peer mark is another one of those assignment types that is in Feedback Studio. So once the students have all turned in a paper assignment in Feedback Studio, you can then assign the same student a peer mark assignment. And it's basically the same thing as conducting a peer review activity in your class. You have to distribute it how you want to. You get a lot of controls as the instructor in Feedback Studio. And you get to either use, like the rest has said, the pre-loaded questions, which there are quite a few of them, or you can create your own in the library. So I would just say that you can take advantage of peer mark within Feedback Studio and conduct that same level of peer review that you were doing in the class. You get to see what the remarks that the student made as well. And I used to make those worth points. So it just depends on how you want to do that. And right now, you may just want to make that a formative assignment, and it's not worth points with remote learning, but it's up to you. It's so important though. The motivation for me to get things done early because a peer was going to see my work was really high. So
Right.
that's just something to think about.
And peer mark, they don't see one another's originality reports either. They're really just seeing the text of the paper.
Right, right.
Mhm.
Great, thanks so much for touching on that, guys. So we have about 17 minutes left, so if we could quickly touch on some of the ways students can use Feedback Studio to gain access to formative feedback, and then I'll wrap it up for key takeaways, and then we can open it up for the larger Q&A. I have a lot of great questions coming in, so I want to make sure we put some time aside to address those.
Yeah, so how can students use Feedback Studio to gain access to formative feedback? So there's a couple of things that happen right away. If you open the settings in your Feedback Studio, you can have them look at the ETS E-Rater material, which is the grammar and the syntax and everything else. This can populate right away. They also can see the similarity report. And I think that that's really important when you're thinking about right now fake news, source credibility, but more than that, it's about career and college readiness and knowing that, okay, this is kind of, I didn't exactly cite that correctly, or I didn't exactly paraphrase that correctly. Let me go back and correct myself in this moment when I still have that chance. And you know, it's just really about building those skills for the future. So the other part that has to do with formative feedback is not only do the instructors have a portfolio of writing, but the student has a portfolio of writing. So they have access to all of the stuff that they have turned in on Turnitin throughout the years, and they can look back and see how much they've grown over the year or 4 years if it's a 9th to 12th grader who's had access the whole time. And that's great because the amount of growth should be immense from 9th to 12th grade in writing.
Right. And, you know, one way to really kind of figure out what it is that Feedback Studio can do is to play with it and to have your students submit essays and then just go ahead and play with those features. ETS E-Rater is one of my favorite because it goes through and it marks for students all of those like little details that are essential to writing, but you can get bogged down by sometimes as an educator. And then it gives you the opportunity to really go in and provide constructive and meaningful feedback, which is absolutely key. The way I learned how to use Feedback Studio was by just jumping in and learning to use it with my students. It was a learning process for me, just like it was for them. So kind of playing with how sensitive ETS E-Rater was, how sensitive I could make those originality reports, teaching them how to use that feedback as well. I was known for making those originality reports really sensitive because I wanted all of the quotes that I had asked my students to integrate into their writing. I wanted all of those to be flagged as well so that as their teacher and before students could see it themselves, they can see the originality report initially, that all of those quotes were flagged as well, not as plagiarism, but as what I had asked them to do, which was to integrate all of that information into their papers.
Yeah, that's a solid point. And you know, the other thing is with ETS Rater, you can actually link out to the handbook that's connected to it. And so it's that next step. If a student sees that ETS Rater flagged them for the same issue throughout the paper, they can say, what even is this? And if they click into it, the purple layer, that then takes them to another screen, and then they can read about what that grammar mistake is. And that really allows the teacher to, like you said, to get to the point of the assignment, you know, get to them actually helping them guide their thinking through a essay, report, script, whatever the assignment is. It all can go into to Turnitin, and you can really get to what did you need them to explain in that assignment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Great. So thank you so much, Autumn and Larissa. Some really great best practices you shared. I just kind of want to recap here, and then I want to get to a couple of the questions. So really some of the key takeaways I just wanted to kind of reinforce from today's session is, you know, providing that ongoing formative feedback is really going to, you know, benefit students a lot, right? It's going to help them learn more. It's going to help them learn smarter. And then, you know, it's going to help them really take ownership of their work and become those self-directed learners, right? That really has a big impact when you start thinking about college and career readiness. On the instructor side of things, you know, it can really help you to evaluate how effective your teaching practices are, you know, and then if there's certain students who are struggling, you can like quickly adapt your instruction to close those learning gaps, right? So in talking about how feedback studio can be used as a means of formative assessment, you know, what are some of the benefits, right? Number one, it really helps students to build their confidence. When they have that safe space to, you know, kind of improve their work and do multiple drafts, it really can help to build that confidence. And then on the instructor side of things, you can, with a lot of the great commenting and feedback tools that they mentioned today, such as the quick marks and the voice comments and things along those lines, it really provides instructors a way to really provide that timely formative feedback and, you know, make sure it's meaningful and make sure students are clear about those next steps. And then again, you know, I spoke to this earlier, but it can really help you to identify those concepts that students are struggling with and help to quickly adapt instruction to, you know, help close those learning gaps. And then ultimately, you know, by providing formative feedback, you know, through Feedback Studio, it can really help to, you know, transform plagiarism into teachable moments. So yeah, those are some of the key takeaways that I wanted to reinforce. We hope this session was beneficial. I did see some questions in the chat coming through. They were looking for more of kind of like a demo of the Feedback Studio. Let me know if that's something you're interested in. You can respond to the follow-up email tomorrow, and we can, you know, ensure that we can provide you some some tutorials and some different webinars that will actually show you how to navigate a lot of these functionalities within the platform, right? And I'll also be sending a one-pager as part of the follow-up, which really calls up some of the key capabilities, settings, and features that you want to be familiar with and confident using in order to use Feedback Studio as a means for formative assessment. So yeah, now I'm going to open up some of the Q&A here. One question that we had from Dr. Pad Massey, apologies if I messed that up. How can formative assessment be applicable for large student groups, say around 90 per section?
Oh, I actually have a great idea that is borrowed from our friend. I'm not sure about the 90 per section, but what she would do when she was grading, you know, 60 to 90 papers, is she kept a running list of all of the issues that she was seeing that were coming up over and over again, maybe not with every single paper. But with enough. And this was typically with timed writes. So these were handwritten essays that were submitted in class. So she would keep this running list and give the students back their papers, go over what the full list was that was typically across 2 or 3 sections of the same course. And then students would look for those issues in their own paper, and note it, and then have to make those changes. So say it's passive voice, she would talk a little bit about passive voice, and have students look for passive voice in their papers and then change it from passive voice to active voice. I thought that it was really effective. I actually went in and I watched her do it in her classroom on at least one occasion, because it wasn't something that I was really good at myself, but it was fantastic.
Something that I might suggest too is after they've turned in the initial assignment and maybe it's because 90-person section, you have quite a bit of work to do before you can get anything back to them. I would think about offering a reflection assignment as a self-grading. So allow the students to really take the opportunity to grade themselves. I've been reading some research lately, and it says that is it's a hard process to grade yourself, right? You have to take that moment outside of what you just turned in, this baby of a research report, and go over it as the rubric is sitting right next to you and actually grade yourself. And a lot of students, they grade themselves harder than the teacher would. So
Oh yeah, much. And
yeah.
I always had students grade themselves and do a lot of self-assessment as well as reflection, and it was really fascinating to see how hard they were on themselves. Whereas I would be like, oh, that's okay, you'll fix it for next time. They'd be like, no, I never should have done this in the first place.
Yeah.
Great, thanks for that, guys. We have another question from some math. Is the peer review aimed to teach the reviewer or the reviewee or both? If both, then how do you evaluate?
It's a little bit of both. I think that the feedback is essential for that that initial writer, but I think, when I was looking at the peer reviews that were submitted in my classroom, I really wanted to see not so much evidence of who they were at the moment as writers, but evidence of who they were as readers, because that relationship between reading and writing is essential. And so in class all the time, we were teaching close reading skills. And so this was an opportunity for them to show who they were as readers, because really a peer review is a way of giving some sort of, rhetorical analysis kind of feedback, which is what we were typically doing in my class, not just in AP, but in other levels as well.
Yeah, peer review can be a combination. It really depends on how you want to use it. That's what I always say with Feedback Studio. You're the driver, you're the instructor. So, you can have students look at editing and revision, which is a skill they need to learn and something that you have to actually explicitly teach them. And that can be the most tedious type of peer review, because it's all about the mechanics and it's going over with the fine-tooth comb. But you also can have them respond to the writing. When I've done using PeerMark, exampling, demoing it with adult learners, we actually have them respond to the writing in some sort of way, like give some sort of, okay, what could you go on from this, synthesize this, so what do we do next? So I mean, you can do the whole thing that Larissa just said. I love that you're seeing if they're comprehending what they're reading, but how did they respond as well? Because clearly, thinking about career and college readiness and distance learning right now, a lot of the way that we're communicating is through online communications, emails, messaging like Slack or GChat or anything like that. So being able to communicate back and forth with someone in those situations is a skill in itself. So I'd say both, if that answered the question.
Yeah, that's great.
Hopefully.
Yeah, so we have a couple more minutes. One question that Tony asked is, how do you approach formative assessment with struggling, disengaged students?
I think that formative assessment gives you the opportunity to re-engage students. Typically, if a student is struggling, there might be there might be other reasons outside of your classroom environment that are leading to them struggling or to them not being engaged. And I speak as the parent of a struggling, disengaged student, especially when it comes to writing. But it also gives you an opportunity for those like micro-sized teachable moments. So that if you know a student has an IEP or a 504, and there are specific things that they should be working toward as their own personal goals as learners, then that feedback that you provide can help them achieve those goals. So if their goal is, it has to do with mechanics, then you can give feedback that helps support their growth in having correct mechanics in their papers. Some of that can be done automatically through ETS e-rater, but if you're noticing growth, like, hey, you got everything capitalized the first time, then you can give praise, or like that idea of a glow and grow, or a single point rubric. Autumn and I have talked about those before. So you can really make that feedback very specific for that student, and it helps them understand that as their teacher, you have seen who they are. It's not just something circled on a rubric. You're giving them something that engages them. So, and it might be like, hey, I'm not really sure why you wrote about bicycles in this paper when I know that you have a passion for video games. Next time, write about something that you're passionate about, because I bet that paper will show your excitement for your subject, and then you're going to naturally want to make it a little bit better.
Yeah, that's motivation, that passion, motivation. It's like connect it to their future. Whatever you know them pretty clearly through their writing, and it's just connect it to what they want to be when they grow up. Connect it to how this is going to affect them later on, and that's a way to clearly connect with a disengaged student. But just make sure that they know that they can make changes and they see that path to getting a little bit better. That's sometimes with the disengaged learners, it's just they have that writer's block, or they just feel like they can't get started. So I love that idea of chunking it out into those small pieces that Larissa said, like that first paragraph. Once we get that done, then we can move on to the next piece. Once we get that done, we can get on to the next piece. And the other thing Larissa said was the positive feedback, thinking again for the older learners. I love it when I get a piece of positive feedback with a chunk of my giant dissertation I'm sending in, because it's like, yeah, I know there was some things that need to be fixed, but I also like that you wrote those little nice pieces too. So so mix it up with those learners.
Well, and then I can't remember what it is, but that Hattie effect size for having a teacher actually like believe in you and believe in your ability to grow is enormous. I think it's one of the highest effect sizes that is there. I wish I should have written it down, but it's right, bigger than almost anything.
Well, first off, I want to thank you both, Autumn and Larissa, for a really great conversation today and really kind of sharing your expertise with the larger audience. So again, thank you all for joining us today. We will be sending out a follow-up email tomorrow with some resources for you to, further explore a lot of the things we discussed today. And yeah, thank you so much. And we hope you have a good rest of your week and you all stay healthy and sane. So thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.